everyone. Timothy Ferris here with a few words about slavery, a hideous practice that was commonplace among humans far back into our prehistory and was made illegal only with the rise of the liberal democracies. Slavery appears to have arisen from war for the following reason. If you imagine a prehistoric conflict which might involve maybe just 100 or so warriors, or in other cases 1,000 or so, typically involved in a conflict with a neighbor, one impinging on the other, or fighting over any of the many things that humans have fought over in their whole history and that other primates fight over as well, and you won such a conflict, you would have on your hands the surviving enemy. The women and children in this group could be enslaved and taken home with you, sold to become typically household servants. People who could help out around the house, either in towns or on farms where there's always need for more laborers. This practice was widespread. It emerges into history amongst the ancient Persians, the Greeks. Epictetus, the great Stoic philosopher, was a slave, most likely introduced into his household as a boy, whose owner eventually freed him on the basis of his brilliance. This practice was so common that the Sumerian word for slave means woman from another country. For Sumerians, most of the women from other cultures that they might encounter would be household slaves brought back as captives from wars and other conflicts. Slavery was so widely practiced that Aristotle and other philosophers mostly defended it, and even Epictetus would less attack slavery as an institution than to champion free thinking, telling his students that if you acted as less than a fully free individual, you were making a slave of yourself. That left the issue of what to do with the able-bodied men whose society or village or whatever you had conquered. You couldn't just let them go for fear that they'd make war on you again. And simply killing them, getting someone to kill hundreds and hundreds of unarmed men just standing there with their hands bound, was a horrible idea and difficult for any military leader to enforce or want to enforce. So the men could be sold into slavery elsewhere. You couldn't bring them back home with you, but you could send them off to low-grade enterprises that had profit margins so tight that they couldn't really operate very well if they were paying their laborers anything like a decent wage. The classic example were the salt mines. Sending slaves to salt mines was such a common practice that my father's generation, working people would still refer to their jobs as going to the salt mines. I was visiting a salt mine in the Midwest once because there was a physics experiment running down there. So I was flying back. The businessman next to me, having his first cocktail, asked how my day had gone, and I said I had spent it in a salt mine. And he never said another word for the rest of the flight. I think he must have thought I was speaking metaphorically. But slave labor in the ancient salt mines was a very real and horrible thing. I visited a salt mine run in the old days by the Roman Empire in Sicily, and the thing that was in a way most terrible about it was its size. Not that it was large, but that it was small. It was simply a pit in the ground, maybe the size of a couple of football fields and perhaps 60 feet in depth. Slaves would be brought there shackled. They would have walked all the way from whatever point of conflict they had survived. And they would be marched down a single set of steps carved into the side of the salt walls of this mine. And there they would remain for all the rest of their lives, working all the daylight hours, sleeping, eating minimal rations, working until they died. That was the state of male slavery. But as these sorts of jobs expanded with the Roman Empire, so did the profitability of the slave trade. When I was a student reading about Julius Caesar, it was always said that his conquests in what is now France and Germany had made him a fortune, and he'd returned to Rome a wealthy man. And of course, the spoils of war, as they were called, did include a lot of gold and jewelry and stuff, and Caesar did bring all that back, and some of it he distributed to the people to garner political support. But a major source of his fortune was slavery. He traveled with slave merchants in his entourage, and every time the Roman legions scored a victory, and hundreds of combat-age men would be standing there bound up, Caesar would simply sell them to the slave traders who would take them away. It was very convenient and profitable for him and for other Roman generals. So historically, slavery was not some new development, but has been a part of the human story as far as we know anything about that story. It was found even in the New World when Lewis and Clark extended their expedition, first getting beyond the boundaries of what was known to the white colonists. They encountered early on a slave operation run by American Indians coming out of the Rocky Mountains, come across the country, attacking villages and taking slaves, and then sell them at a confab held each spring on the Missouri River. There was a major American Indian slave operation running on the west coast from Alaska down through what's now British Columbia, all the way into northern California. And it's important to note, since there are ideological fantasies preaching to the contrary, that slavery for most of its history was not race-based. It was not a case of people being all racist and going out to enslave other people because they thought they were subhuman. That came later. Starting in around 1400, when white Europeans began purchasing slaves from African enterprises, typically in West Central Africa. The African slave trade intensified when farming of marginal crops in the New World by white settlers, crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton, created a market for slaves. In all, more than 12 million Africans were enslaved and dispatched across the waters, about 3% of whom arrived in the United States, where they were put to work in the states of what became the Confederacy. Racism, I would say, arose more from the state of slavery than anyone starting out with racist ideas and then using them to establish slavery. Historically, people will enslave any people that are economically viable up until the rise of the rule of law. The American writer Zora Neale Hurston interviewed around 1930 a man who had been enslaved as a teenager on the west coast of Africa. His father was head of his village, and they were part of the vast slave empire of the Dahomey. And his father had offended the king of the Dahomey people, who dispatched a small army, including the famous female warriors, some of whom were Tuareg and others of whom appeared to have been trained by Tuareg. Their approach was to enter the village, demand supplication, and kill on the spot anyone who failed to obey their orders in every detail. This man told Hurston that he saw his father beheaded by a female warrior who said that she was bringing him back to the capital of Dahomey. His father refused, knowing that he would simply be paraded on the streets and then executed there, and was immediately decapitated for his disobedience. The young man was shackled and put aboard a slave ship and brought to the New World after the slave trade had been rendered illegal by Britain and the United States. But there were still these slave operations running in something like the way that drug smuggling operations go on today, often in the same waters. And he said what most shocked him was being put up on the auction block naked, looking down the faces of these white men bidding to own him, and realizing that they thought that this was how Africans lived, naked, without a culture. That brought tears to his eyes even decades later when, as a freedman, he recalled it to Ms. Hurston. Slavery was made illegal by the liberal democracies. In England, well-off women began a campaign against using sugar, which was grown mostly with slave labor in British holdings in the Caribbean. Don't use sugar in your tea, they said. Use honey instead. The movement was so successful that soon the British Navy was ordered to intercept slave ships off the west coast of Africa and shut down the enterprise of empires like Dahomey. The U.S. declared chattel slavery illegal and fought a civil war that claimed 500,000 lives to make it apply to the South and to break down the feudal system of slave labor that functioned there. But the abolition of slavery still has a way to go. An estimated 8 million slaves are still to be found in India. China is said to have more than 1 million slaves. North Korea has more than 2 million slaves, and slavery can be found in the backwaters of Indonesia, Russia, and the Congo. In addition to the traditional forms of slavery, one encounters modern slaving operations such as the traffic in sex slaves. Most of the liberal democracies have here and there in cities apartments that no one knows much about, operate like brothels with women and boys who have been brought there against their will and given no opportunity to escape. Dealing with these remaining vestiges of slavery will involve the same institutions that got rid of legal chattel slavery in the first place: liberal democracy, the political philosophy that starts with individual freedom and equality under the law. Thanks for listening. See you next time.